Peer support programs are primarily things we use in middle schools and high schools. And what they are is we have a student with a severe disability, like autism, and they're a vehicle for that student to be working in a regular education class while both participating socially and academically with the kids without disabilities in the classroom.
And why do you think this is such a good idea?
Well, back in the 1980s, what we now know as the term inclusion was coined, and there was a strong emphasis in how do we get kids from being in separate programs, separate classrooms, or even separate schools, and have them participate in the center, in the core of regular education classes. And for students with more severe disabilities, that was a real challenge, and people really didn't know how in the world do you take a student who might be functioning at the 2 or 3-year-old level intellectually, but who might be 15 or 16 years old chronologically. How do you have them in a calculus class or an English class or a history class and have them there and participating in a meaningful, significant way, not just for them but for the other kids in the class as well.
So how do you feel the mainstream students are getting something out of this type of peer program?
Well, what we've seen over the last 2 decades is that the peers without disabilities get a range of things from this type of support program. They get an opportunity to work with a student who needs to rely on somebody else for help, so they learn responsibility for helping support somebody else. They often get some academic assistance from other teachers in the classroom who have a special education background and are very good at presenting information in alternative ways with some modifications for those students. And they get a sense of just general responsibility and an opportunity to kind of expand their range of classroom experiences.
So I know a lot of people would probably think it's just the straight-A students who should be these student peers. But how does a teacher pick someone? And should they always pick the smartest kid in the class to be the peer?
Well, we do get the quarterbacks and the cheerleaders and the future Nobel laureates. They do often volunteer for these programs. But what we often do in programs, particularly when they're well established, is we ask the students to volunteer very discreetly, either before the semester starts or during the first few weeks of class to serve as a peer support. And what we get are some kids that would surprise you. Sometimes those kids wearing Gothic clothing or the kids that are considered conduct disordered are actually the ones who want the most to work with a student with disabilities.
And why is that?
We don't really know, to be honest. What we do know, though, is those students who are not doing well academically, who volunteer for these peer support programs, often improve their grades quite substantially in the class. And what happens is the student without a disability is working with a student with a disability. They're monitored or supervised by an adult. It might be a paraprofessional, it might be a special education teacher. And that special education teacher, paraprofessional, provides them with ongoing feedback about how they're doing. And the student without disability is responsible for adapting the materials and content of the class for the functioning level of the student with disabilities. And what we see is usually a 1, 2, or 3 grade level improvement for those students. So we quite often see students who are flunking the class get C's or B's, and students that are getting D's improving to the B and A range. It's not at all unusual to see that. And just as importantly, the students, those Nobel laureates of the future, they often maintain their A's. So it doesn't seem to be a process that degrades the student's academic performance anyway. So it seems to be pretty much a win-win situation for students. It's really enjoyable to see students who the teacher said, oh no, he volunteered to be your peer support. And then at the end of the semester, the teacher going, I didn't know he was capable of doing things like that. That was just a wonderful semester experience.
Oh, that's great. So you've based this book on 20 years of research that you've done and your peers have done. What is some of that research that inspired you to want to write this type of guidebook?
Well, we've been conducting very carefully controlled experiments for the last 20 years, manipulating a variable here, a variable there, chasing down new findings and trying to understand why we're getting them. All of it very much in research ease, being published in very nice journals that other scientists read. that it can even be challenging for a accomplished classroom teacher to pick up a journal and adapt the practices, and very, very challenging for a parent who might be interested in promoting this type of thing in the school where their child goes. Mm-hmm. So my co-author is Eric Carter, who's a former Vanderbilt student, and Lisa Cushing, who's a former Vanderbilt faculty member, and I decided we would write a manual that just procedurally described for a teacher or a parent how you go about building these programs and maintaining them, and ways that you can help promote kids with and without disabilities benefiting from them.
And how should a teacher start? What's that first step that a teacher or a parent should take?
Well, if you want to start a program like this, there are several steps you need to do almost simultaneously. You need to make sure that the school and the school administration are supportive of inclusion, that they want to promote kids with disabilities being in regular education classes, and not just being in the class, but participating in the class and being a member of the class. Then you have to find general education teachers who share that mission and are willing to work towards it. And then you have to find good matches between the students' individualized education program, the goals they're supposed to be meeting, and classes. And then once you have that mixture together, you can then, we usually just ask kids without disabilities to volunteer. And 20 years ago, that was really an unusual proposition. Kids were like, well, what is autism? What is significant intellectual disability? We've never met a student like that. How do we get a wheelchair in the classroom? And now, usually the kids have grown up together. They've often gone to preschool together. They've gone to kindergarten, elementary school together. So usually it's like more along the lines of, I'll be glad to work with Jane this semester. I worked with her a couple of years ago, and I really enjoyed it when we were in 6th grade, and now that we're in 9th grade, I'd like to do it again. So it's a process that kind of builds up over time and helps kind of self-perpetuate it.
So what's your take on parents who feel that when there's a special needs student in the classroom, it takes away from the other students?
And that's a great question. Parents should ask that question, and they should get a real straightforward answer about, is the student with disabilities going to detract from the overall academic experience of my child? And what I can say is that we've been doing this for 20 years, and we've been measuring the performance of kids without disabilities in those classrooms across arts, sciences, math, and we just don't see a decrease in the performance of the kids, either the peer support or the children around them. We just don't see that. But what we do see is the biggest challenge is if that child with a disability has serious behavior problems. That becomes very challenging, and the behaviors need to be managed effectively for this type of process to work well.
And what reaction are you getting from schools that are doing this program?
The peer support program has become very popular nationally. It's used in a wide array of schools across east to west coast, urban schools, rural schools, suburban schools. It's become a primary means of providing instruction in regular education, kind of inclusion contexts. So it's become it's not only a well-documented, evidence-based educational practice, meaning it has a scientific foundation to it that it works, but it's also something people are using quite a bit.
So what do you hope will come from this book after it gets out and more teachers and parents read this guidebook?
Well, what we hope is that more teachers and more parents will have ready access to how you go about engaging in this peer support process, and that it'll increase the number of people doing it and doing it effectively. And one of the values of a manual like this is that it's a resource so that people can go back to it and say, aha, see here on page 43, it says that these are the ways we should be doing procedure X and how we should modify them given context Y. So it's a way of disseminating the information in a readily accessible form, but also becomes a reference manual for people to use over time.